All right, well, thanks for joining us today. If you're new here, we are in the third part of what we call a series, and it's called Not For Me, Not For Me. We're talking about the reasons that people don't like church. It could be the reasons that your friends don't like church, or maybe family members. Maybe there's someone in your life that you've been trying to get to church, and they've got their reasons why. Or maybe you're here today, and you're a not for me. Or maybe today you're an okay, fine, right? And maybe these are the reasons that you don't like church. And now, I don't need to tell you this, but there's always a reason behind a rejection, right? No matter what the rejection is or what it has to do with, there's always a reason why. Just this past week, I was away at this conference in Atlanta. It was a church conference, and it was like one of those all-day things where we're just, like listening to speaker after speaker after speaker. And so like midway through the day, I start to drag a little bit. I normally don't drink coffee, but on this day, I needed to. And so I go out, and they're giving away coffee. They've got these sponsors out there, and they're all really nice. And so I'm like, okay, sure. So I go over, I get a cup of coffee, and I take a sip of it, and I'm no coffee expert, but I knew there was something in my mouth that didn't feel like coffee. So I reach into my mouth and I pull out a centipede. Yeah. And I look down and there are legs just in the coffee. And it took me about 5 minutes to get it all out of my mouth. It was the most disgusting thing that's ever been in my mouth. I'm sorry if you're drinking coffee right now. We do check for centipedes. Okay, but here's my point. I just needed to get that story into the message today because No, there's always a reason for a rejection. And for the rest of the day, every time I passed by one of those stands, it was not for me. And they didn't know why, but I knew why. Well, one person knew why. But for us, every day, there are people that hear, talk, think about the church and throw out like the no, not for me. What we're asking are, what are the reasons for the rejection? Even if it requires us to be really honest and look at ourselves in the mirror. Like, what are the whys behind the not for me? If you haven't been with us over the past few weeks, and even if you have, it's probably good to know that when Jesus was around, his presence was magnetic. The people who were nothing like him wanted to be around him. He attracted the religious, the irreligious, the believers, the non-believers, people who had a lot of things, people who had nothing. Everyone wanted to hear him. His presence was magnetic. And he told his followers, very simply, that he was going to leave and that he wanted them to love people the way that he loved them. And then he gave up his life as an expression of that love, which just raised the standard even higher. But what's crazy is that when he left, this movement, this group of people, which we now call the church, they did it. They actually did it. And he said they would be known by the way they love one another. And they actually were. Like, we have these ancient documents where leaders in the Roman Empire who were not part of this group of believers, they were like, these people treat our people better than we treat our people. Like, it just really blew people's minds. And so it's this amazing movement, but there were still people that were like, no, that's not for me. And Jesus said that there always would be the not for me's. So there were then, and there are now. That will never change. But what has changed are the reasons for the not for me's. Jesus said that he would be the reason for the not for me. He referred to himself, and his followers later on referred to Jesus as the stumbling block. Jesus' claims about himself would get in the way of people believing. Like I may love those church people and the way they live and how they give and how they like just offer themselves to one another. Like they offer a vision of life that is so attractive and breathtaking, but I just can't wrap my mind around the idea that this guy was God, Jesus, and so it's not for me. He said that would happen. He said it would happen. What has changed, though, is the reason for the not for me. Now, I don't know if your experience has been like my experience, but I don't hear people saying that when they're like, no, I'm not into church. What I hear is, well, they're judgmental, they're fake, they're self-righteous, they're hypocritical, and they just want your money. And so often, the reason changes from Jesus to the church. And the question is, well, should it be that way? Is this just the reality that we have to live with? Or is there something we can do about it? If you're with us, you know we've been saying, no, the church is not supposed to be the reason that people don't like church. And so the question that I'm hoping, if you've been here, you'll continue to ask, especially if you consider this your church home. Every time you hear a not for me, behind every not for me, is he the reason or are we? Is it something about us that shouldn't be? What do we need to do to fix it? And so last week, we jumped into this idea of being judgmental. Judgmental. It's the first reason, the most common reason people give for not wanting to be part of a church or having an issue with the church. The church is just judgmental. Are they supposed to be like that? Are we supposed to be known as people who are judgmental? I don't have time to unpack the whole thing today. If you want, you can go online and listen to the message from last week. But the answer is no. The Apostle Paul, who wrote a huge chunk of the New Testament, said, what business is it of mine to judge the world? None. And so how did we go from like being known for love, like we were supposed to be known, to being known as judgmental? And so we unpacked that a little bit, and we said in light of that, if we're supposed to be that way, the way that we maintain our focus and make sure that we don't become that way for us as a church, we value two of our values. We say you can belong before you believe. You can call this your church home before you buy into anything that we believe. That has to come first. And belief, the first step of believing happens in an instant, but it doesn't all happen in an instant, right? Trust is built. And so if that's true, then you have to have permission to be in progress. If we really don't want to be known as people who are judgmental. And so that was last week. And the time that we have this week, here's how we'll start out, all right? Have you ever seen someone do something or say something? Or have you ever heard about something someone said that doesn't quite line up with what you know about them? You know? It doesn't sit right. So you just kind of try to, all right, well, just like push it aside. But it just hangs out back there. You know? Like, what was going on there? Are we going to talk about that? Usually there's a point in the relationship you can't pass. There's a level of closeness you can't have until that thing is addressed. There's a guy who I met when I first moved to the area, and we were in similar circles, and we were like always passing each other, seeing each other, like, hey, you know, and he found out we were starting a church, and eventually we did start the church, and we just had all these nice little interactions, right? Well, one day, this was in January of 2020, before the whole world turned upside down, he shows up, and I was like, whoa, he came to church. That's crazy. He brought his family. Wow. So we had staff meeting that Monday, and we're sitting down. I'm like, oh, there's this guy. I see him every once in a while. We pass each other. I say, hey. He showed up on Sunday, and I described him. And Tom, if you haven't met Tom, he's one of the other pastors here. He goes, oh, that guy? Yeah, I know some people that know that guy. Turns out he thinks you're a jerk. And I was like, oh, all right, I guess I misread that relationship, the way things were going there. And it kind of bothered me. I didn't understand, like, what did I do? How did this unfold? We haven't really even had like much of a conversation. And what's funny is that he and I kind of started to become friends. We started hanging out. We passed each other more often. Eventually, it was like we were intentionally spending time with one another. He was a friend of mine. But the whole time, in the back of my mind, I'm like, are we ever gonna talk about that? Like, can we address that? What actually happened? And there came a point where I just came out and said, all right, so what was the deal there? Like, this is what I heard. And pretty quickly, we got to the bottom of it. Turns out there was miscommunication. It was a little bit of the game of telephone, and he doesn't anymore think that I'm that much of a jerk. And we moved on. But my point is, it just like, we couldn't get past that point until we dealt with it. There are some things, if you're somebody who's been in the church for a while, I'm willing to bet, at least if you're like me, that there are some things like that in our relationship with God, in our understanding of God, at least. Where, we talk about how great he is, how good he is, how loving he is, he's this, he's that, he's what, and then he does some things, and it's like, ooh, okay, are we ever gonna talk about that? Because that doesn't seem to line up with everything else we know about him. And today is one of those passages. It's not an easy passage to look at, but it's one that we have to address. Or we can only go so far in our understanding of God. And if you're someone who considers themselves a not for me, and you've got your reasons why, what you might see, in fact, what I hope you see, is that one of the things you probably don't like about the church, one of the issues, something you have against the church, what I want you to see is that God is standing right there next to you against that very same thing. And so this whole thing kind of happens in the church when it first starts. It's amazing. Things are like going really well. This guy named Luke is recording everything that happened. He's writing it down in detail. And he gets to this point, in different points of his, his letter, his story, what we call the book of Acts, where he kind of stops and he summarizes. And then he unpacks that summary a little bit. And he gets to the summary point. He's like, things were great. Everybody, they were all of, he says, one heart and one mind. Like, they were so unified. It was like they were just one. They loved each other so much. It's like fantastic, amazing things. He says, there's even people that were selling their land and property just so that they could give to people who didn't have what they needed in that little community. It was amazing. All right. And then he unpacks it and he goes into detail. He's like, all right, so there's this guy named Joseph. You know him as Barnabas. Now, if you're reading this for the first time as someone like back in the day when Luke first wrote it, you'd be like, oh, I know Barnabas, because Barnabas was the guy who trained the apostle Paul. And so Barnabas has like risen to a position of prominence. And it's like, okay, Barnabas, Joseph, Barnabas, what's the deal with him? Yeah, he was one of those guys that sold land, and he took all the proceeds and he gave them to the apostles, to Peter, to John, to those guys, just to say, like, I am so on board with this. Here, use this to serve the people, the community. And then he gets a nickname for it. His name is Joseph. They started calling him Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. That's pretty cool. But then there's this threat. It's the first time we see a threat handled swiftly, in a way that is uncomfortable, but it's in light of what Barnabas has just done. And here's how Luke records it. He says, now, a man named Ananias, together with his wife Sapphira, also sold a piece of property, just like Barnabas. With his wife's full knowledge, they had a talk. He kept back part of the money for himself, but brought the rest and put the rest at the apostles' feet. Now, there's an assumption here. It's a little bit unclear in the translation, but there's an assumption that he's saying, hey, we sold it for this much. Here, have it. But actually, he sold it for more and kept back some for himself. He's trying to appear more generous. The two of them are trying to appear more generous than they actually are. And so Peter gets this money and he responds. He says this. It says, then Peter said, he doesn't say thanks, unfortunately. He says, Ananias, how is it that Satan, the devil, has so filled your heart, your motives, that you've lied to the Holy Spirit, God, and have kept for yourself some of the money you received for the land? And then he asks questions, and we understand a little more the issue with what he did. He says, didn't it belong to you before it was sold? Like, you didn't need to sell it. It was yours. You could have kept it. And then he goes on, and he says, and after it was sold, wasn't the money at your disposal? You could have split it in half and said, here, you have some, I'll have some. You can have none. You have a little, I'll take a lot. But he doesn't represent what actually happened accurately. He says, you could have done what you want. What made you think of doing such a thing? You have not lied just to people, human beings, but to God. It says, buckle up. It says, when Ananias heard this, he fell down and died. On the spot. Just like that. Some people say he died of natural causes, maybe had a heart attack, but the language is pretty clear that God was involved in this. It says that great fear seized all who heard what had happened. And then some young men came forward, wrapped up his body, and carried him out and buried him. The story's not over, though. It says about 3 hours later, his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. She's coming in to get a pat on the back. She's coming in to find out what her nickname's gonna be. And no one's told her about her husband. Peter asked her, tell me, is this the price you and Ananias got for the land? Yes, she said, that is the price. Peter said to her, how could you conspire to test the Spirit of the Lord? Listen, the feet of the men who buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out also. It says at that moment, she fell down at his feet and died. Then the young men came in, finding her dead. They carried her out, buried her beside her husband. It's a tough story to hear. For me, I hated that story. And for a long time, and maybe you're here right now, like, you believe God is this angry, judgmental, power-hungry, rule-giving, like merciless God who's just ready to drop the hammer on you because you stepped out of line. And there he is. See? And all those Christians who are judgmental, well, if my God is like that, who's gonna drop the hammer on someone who played with the numbers, well, then it makes sense that Christians are so judgmental. I don't want to believe in that God. That's the way God is. Right? Sometimes, at least, like not too long ago, Jesus was hanging on a cross next to a criminal. And the criminal's like, sorry? And Jesus is like, all right, you'll be with me in paradise. And then just a little while later, you have these people that are doing something nice. They're giving something away, but they're not totally honest about it, and they die, like on the spot. What's the deal with that? Which version of God are we gonna get? It makes God look like this emotional, impulsive, inconsistent force of judgment. When I was in high school, there was a teacher, and she was great, but we never really knew what we were gonna get with her. You know, like some days she'd be in such a good mood, she would, cancel the test and we'd talk about Disney movies. And it was great. And my friends and I, we would communicate throughout the day. And they'd be like, yo, don't worry about the homework, you didn't do the homework. We're talking about Disney movies today, it's fine, she's in a great mood. Other days, she was not in such a great mood. And if you didn't get the pop quiz right, she'd like send you out of the classroom, be so frustrated that you're not taking things seriously. And so we talk about it, be like, is it like a Disney movie day or like a get kicked out of class day? We just never knew what we were gonna get. And this is the picture here, at least if this is, you see God dropping the hammer because somebody lied, this is the picture that we're getting. And so what's the deal here? Do we just, and maybe you have, especially if you've been in the church, do we just be like, okay, go next part, like can we get to the Jesus loves me, where Jesus does something so nice or stands up for someone, like because I just want to bury that. But if we're gonna be honest about what we believe, we have to have that talk, like there needs to be a time where we address that. Or we can only go so far. What's going on there? Because that doesn't line up with the version of God that we talk about here. Unless there's something that we're not seeing. And in order to see it, you have to fearlessly look at what's happening in the situation. If you back up a little bit, you can see that there are some crazy things that happen leading up to that story. Like some crazy, horrible things that happen. There are a few people that take the body of Jesus and just like beat the heck out of it and then nail it like a piece of meat to a cross. And they're not treated like this. There's a guy who spits in his face, and he's not treated like this. There's another guy who cuts off someone's ear. If you know the story of Judas, he turned Jesus in. And he hung out with him for 3 years and then turned on him. He's not treated like this. And so, what is the point being made here? What are we missing? And who is this coming from? Peter. If you know Peter's story, literally a few weeks ago at this point, he had just denied Jesus 3 times. Like Jesus was losing his life. It's happening over there in the other room. And he's like, I don't know that guy. Like whatever you're gonna do, I'm just not gonna be part of it. 3 times. Just had the biggest failure of his life. And he is gonna be the one to drop the hammer? What's the deal? What do we do with this? The issue with Ananias and Sapphira is not that they did something bad. It's that they did it to appear good. The issue has nothing to do with greed and everything to do with the fact that they wanted to appear generous. It's not that they did something wrong. It's that they were doing it while trying to appear right. There's a word for this. The word is hypocritical. Now, often we define a hypocrite as someone who says one thing but then does another, but really it's not the definition. The word hypocrite comes from an ancient Greek word that was a term for an actor, someone who played a part. Someone who pretends to be somebody that they're not. And there is nothing more damage than religious hypocrisy. You have to hear this. What we don't have here are 2 well-intentioned people trying to do a good thing, but messing with the numbers a little bit. They are held in contrast to Barnabas, who is in this position of prominence. What we see here are people who are trying to leverage the trust of other people to earn themselves a position of prominence. We have religious people who are acting like one thing, but being another for the sake of being esteemed by everyone else. The idea alone that they have property to sell and give away implies that they're already probably pretty well known in the community. And they're watching and they're like, there's Barnabas. Okay, so you give stuff away to get to the top. Let's give stuff away to get to the top. And the fact that they keep it for themselves, that's not the issue. The issue is why. It reveals that they're not really doing this out of generosity. They're not giving a gift, they're making a purchase. It's not a well-intentioned person getting it right. It is pure deception, and it is seeping into the church. And so God does something unusual. This doesn't still happen. But he makes a point that is unmistakable. He does something extreme to communicate a principle to everyone. His point here is that in the church, Peter said, like, you could keep the money. You could keep some of it, all of it. You didn't even have to sell your land. In the church, you can be flawed, but you cannot be fake. You can't pretend to be someone you're not. Jesus, when he was here, there was one group of people he was constantly in conflict with. One group of people. And it wasn't the people that were doing the wrong thing. It was the people that were pretending to do the right thing. The word hypocrite is used in the New Testament only by Jesus. And if you've ever looked at the church or religious people and felt like they're phonies, they're faking it. You've seen someone who's exposed. They've used their power, their position, they use their trust of like the trust they have of other people to take advantage of others. You've read about it in the news. You've seen the damage. You've heard the horror stories. You hate this, I promise, as much as God does. And what Jesus is saying is there's no room for this in the church. There's an entire chapter where Jesus explains the damaging effects of hypocrites. And every time he's talking about someone who is acting from a position of moral superiority, looking down at everyone else, which is exactly what Ananias and Sapphira were doing. They were pretending to be a certain type of person to separate themselves from everyone else. And he's like, there's no room for that here. The reason why is because it spreads like a virus. He calls hypocrisy yeast. Like you put yeast in bread, poof, it just explodes, right? And it multiplies. When people start pretending, everyone feels like they need to pretend. And what you create is a culture of performance and pretending, and right behind that is judgment. Where everyone who's pretending is on the lookout for the people who are stepping out of line. And Jesus is saying, like, no, just come with your issues. If the church becomes a place where you have to pretend, it communicates that God is someone before whom you need to pretend. And that's the exact opposite of everything we believe. You come as you are, where you are. Jesus said, like, very clearly, I did not come for the healthy. I came for the sick. Or in other words, if you don't think you have problems, I have nothing to offer you. Like, be flawed. Be flawed. Now, I think it's important to point out the whole idea here, he's making a principle, he's presenting this idea. You can be flawed, but you can't be fake. They are intentionally deceiving. You know, they're trying to pretend to be something that they're not. Sometimes we fake it from a place of good intentions, where you feel like, okay, I guess I believe this now. Now I'm supposed to fit this mold. I'm supposed to be this way, use these words. And so we like try to fit ourselves into a place that we're really not yet. And we feel like we have to say we believe things that we really don't yet, which is why we had to talk last week about having permission to be in progress. Because if you don't, you create a culture of pretenders like that. And so he says, come as you are. And if that's gonna be true, then the people in the church cannot create a culture where everyone's pretending to be someone that they're not. There is nothing more damaging to the unity, the appeal, the attraction of the local church than religious hypocrisy. And in the same way, there is few things more powerful than genuine authenticity and vulnerability. And that's what the early church had. They came with their issues. They're like, I've got this problem. Paul himself, who wrote a ton of this stuff, is like, I got a problem with envy, okay? And he just keeps going on. I got another problem. He doesn't tell us what it is, but it won't go away. And he says, I'm the worst of people. There is a keen awareness of his brokenness, and he's unashamed because he believes that his God accepts him completely broken. And so he refuses to pretend. And so if you feel, especially if you're new to church and you're starting to feel the pressure to be a certain way and fit a certain mold, don't. Continue to learn. And you will start to change. And it will come from like fruit. It will be the result of the things you're starting to believe. But don't try to fit a mold. It communicates the exact opposite thing. You know, my wife, Allie, like 2 years ago, maybe a little less than that, I'm not totally sure. There was this one week of telling a story about her. If you know my wife, she's like super, super chill, relaxed. Nothing phases her. Okay, so she's in the garage one day. It's pandemic world. She's got to homeschool the kids. I'm not home. Life is tough. For some reason, we have a puppy. It's in the backyard, and it's not coming in, and she's got to get one of our kids onto their little Zoom thing, and she's in the garage. She can't, and she is just at her wit's end, and she has this convenient, like, baseball bat right next to our toy chest, and she just, like, whacks it, and it breaks. And she tells me this story, and I was like, that's amazing. Because that's just so not her. And I don't remember what the point of that story was the first time I told it. But what I can tell you is that immediately after the service, there have been few Sundays where I've received more feedback than I did that Sunday. People were like, thank you for letting us know that you've got issues, that you're not perfect, that we're in this together. But imagine if you had seen that happen. Like maybe you're a neighbor and you're looking into our yard and you see her, smashing a toy chest with a baseball bat. And so you come around front and knock on the door, see if she's okay. And she answers the door with a smile on her face. Like, hey, you all right? She says, yeah, I was just praying for my kids. What would that do to your concept of what she says she believes? She's fake. She's phony. She's pretending to be somebody she's not. There's nothing more damaging than religious hypocrisy. And so here, one of the things we value here, what we say, you can be flawed, but you can't be fake. Or in other words, we just say no pretending. If you got problems, you don't have to tell us. This is not full transparency, complete exposure, but you don't have to pretend to not have problems. If you have doubts, you can share them as you're ready, but you don't have to pretend to be someplace you're not. If you're not sure about how you feel about a specific issue, you don't have to pretend to believe something just because you feel like you're in a room where everyone else believes it. That's how you create a culture of pretenders. When when a group of people start to pretend, everyone else does. I'm out of time, so I'm going to ask the band to come up here. But The last thing I want to leave you with. I mentioned before, Jesus is the only person to use this word hypocrite in the whole Bible. And it's recorded the most times by a guy named Matthew, by far. Luke uses it once or twice. Mark uses it, I think, once as he's writing the Gospels, as we call them. Matthew uses it 13 times. And there's a whole chapter where Jesus explains the damaging effects of hypocrisy. It's Matthew chapter 23, if you want to read it for yourself. And he starts off, and Jesus explains, and Matthew records, this hypocrisy, it slams the door in the face of people who want to get in. If you know Matthew's story, Matthew was an outcast. He was a tax collector. He was the one who over and over and over again had the door slammed in his face by the religious community. So my question for you, what I want to leave you with, is there a Matthew in your life, if you're a follower of Jesus, that needs to know you have issues? Maybe you've been trying to be a certain way, make a certain impression as a church person, as a follower of Jesus. And maybe the impression that needs to be made is that you are flawed. Maybe that vulnerability is the thing that will bring people in. I think you'd be surprised to see the way that God can work through our brokenness. So we don't need to pretend.